Welcome to the Insurgency with me, Steve Baker. It's the podcast which helps you get beyond the gossip of Westminster to really understand the forces which shape all our lives. Joining me is my co-host, the director of the Fighting for a Free Future project, Harry Richer. So Harry, tell me, who have we got on this time?
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm so excited to introduce our guest today. She is a rising star of the free market movement. At the age of 23, she has appeared across print media, across general media. She's regularly on your screens, whether it's the BBC, Channel 5, Sky, the head of media for the IEA. We are here with the one, the only, Reem Ibrahim.
Thanks, Harry. So there we are. Reem, welcome.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic introduction.
Yeah, we know that you're eloquent, you're courageous, you're insightful. We're really delighted you've joined us.
Me.
Now, before we go any further, why don't you tell everybody how we first met?
The Stephen Reem story. Well, it was December of 2021. I was a young student at the LSE studying at the London School of Economics, and I was a member of the University Society for the Conservatives. And Steve was the fantastic guest speaker at our annual dinner over at the Carlton Club, I believe it was. Oh no, it was the East India Club over at Christmas. And I remember thinking, this is a bit of a weird environment I've never been in before.
The story's starting to sound like it's going wrong.
And I was a bit of an anarcho-capitalist back at university. I was reading people like Murray Rothbard, and I remember thinking, Steve is really great, but he needs to be more radical. He needs to really understand what it is that we're talking about here.
If he's going to carry the student
Yes. And so I remember thinking, at the time, I think I'd gone viral for saying something about the NHS and why we need to privatise it and why a competitive market in healthcare is the best thing. And I went over to Steve and I said, Steve, it's great to meet you. Why can't we just privatise the NHS? And Steve said, it's really great that you're really excited. It's fantastic. I'm really, really happy to know that there are more students that are interested in libertarian ideas. But listen, you've got to think about how you're communicating those ideas. And, if you just go in and say privatise the NHS, people aren't really going to listen to you. And I was like, oh, whatever. Another politician, just, leaving their principles behind. But Steve was correct. And we became friends after
That's
that.
really sweet. Steve was correct. I want that in writing.
Yes, but I would say Reem was correct that we do need to privatise the NHS.
Well,
we do.
We'll come back to that a little bit later. But there's definitely two things wrong with the NHS. It's not good enough and we can't afford it, right?
Well, indeed. And also the fact that we don't have competitive market mechanisms. I mean, the fact that as a patient, you can't choose where you get your healthcare from, I think is absurd, because basically every other country in the world allows you to have that choice. But what was crucial about that conversation, I actually think it had a huge impact on how I ended up communicating liberty in my adult life and in my career, is because what Steve taught me is that whilst being radical and being principled is absolutely important, and we need people to have those principles in the first place. What's really important is how you bring people with you. How do you communicate those ideas, and how do you ensure that the public understand them and also agree with you? It's great being controversial. It's great ensuring that people listen to what you're saying. But if you want to bring people with you and make libertarianism popular, then you have to ensure you're thinking about the communicating style that you're actually using. And so Steve taught me a very important lesson that day.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's a good start to the podcast. Now, I've got to ask you about the journey, because one of the things I've noticed over years now is that the best libertarians typically approach libertarianism from the left. So tell us about your journey from being a Corbynista, presumably because of your big heart that cares about poor people and lifting them up. But how did you go from Corbynista to libertarian?
Well, I was 16 years old when I first started getting interested in politics, and I grew up in Hillingdon, which is a northwest London suburb. And I remember sort of talking to my friends about politics and hearing about Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party and just thinking, wow, this guy has so much charisma, he's really interesting. And I was never really that interested in politics up until that point. I remember my family took us on a weekend trip to Scotland and seeing all the yes, no, and I said, Dad, why is there all these yeses and no's? And he explained what a referendum was, and I heard all about that when I was 12. And so at 16 I was really kind of thinking, what does the Brexit referendum look like? What does it actually mean? I would have probably described myself as a Remainer at the time, and that has since changed. And I remember thinking about what Corbyn was saying, and free Wi-Fi sounds great, all of these fantastic freebies that somebody else is going to pay for sounds great. And I remember thinking, especially when it came to international politics, young people, we tend to, especially when we're in school, really be influenced by our peers and really be influenced by what is seen to be doing the right thing, sort of social justice warrior-esque kind of idea. And this was like peak woke, right? So anybody that was saying, that they were pro-Palestine or anti-racism was basically seen as more moral than the next person. And I was sucked into that. I was absolutely sucked into that. And then I spoke to my friends about it. I had a couple of friends that were already members of the Labour Party, and I became interested. I think we went to an event together where John McDonnell was actually the speaker because he was in the constituency next door over in Hayes. And then I started studying A-level politics, and I first came across the words classical liberal. And I remember thinking, well, this sort of makes quite a lot of sense. Don't hurt me, don't touch my stuff was sort of the epitome of what those ideas meant. And I started to question my big state ideals that I sort of softly had, although I wasn't really ever thinking about them in much detail. And then when it came to the position where I saw what it actually meant for the state to have so much power, what it meant for redistribution to occur, the coercive aspects of the state, I started to question my big government attitude. And as I became more and more politically involved, I joined the Conservative Party, really kind of just as if I want to get involved in politics, I should probably become a member of a party. It wasn't really anything to do with the Conservative Party in itself. I just sort of thought, well, they seem to have some of the ideas that I might be interested in, so let's just join and see what happens. And I made amazing friends in the Conservative Party when I was a young member, and through that I really sort of gained an understanding and a love for discussion and debate. I mean, it really was what I was studying at A-level politics, the John Stuart Mill marketplace of ideas. It's we can all have these conversations, the best ideas will probably succeed because through debate and discussion we can compete with those ideas. And that's when I started to question those big government ideas, and I became more interested in classical liberalism.
Well, I want to bring Harry in a moment, but I just want to dig into something you said there, because in that transition, you talked about what it meant to use the coercive power of the state and to redistribute. So plenty of people on the left are very worried about justice and fairness.
Yeah.
I'm very worried about justice and fairness. Have you sort of reflected on what's going on there about the difference between justice in the outcome and justice in the process?
Absolutely. I mean, this is really the crucial point here, because we can all start by saying we see really bad things happening across the country. We can see that poverty is extraordinarily difficult to live through, and that there are still millions of people that are living in what the government at least describe as absolute poverty. We know that when we are seeing homelessness on the streets, when we see people that are suffering on a daily basis, when you see queues outside of food banks, that is really worrying. And your instinct as a child, sort of your instinct is, well, why isn't somebody helping those people? Why isn't the government giving them some help? Whatever it is, you sort of think, why isn't there a central authority helping those people? And so I think that everybody that is a human being with feelings will look at those people and really wish that something was going on that could help them. The problem is that in most instances, the solution is the government, and the solution is seen as being the government. The solution is seen as being the redistribution of wealth, giving those people financial support directly by taking it from others. And it was that orthodoxy that I began to question when I was in sixth form, when I was studying these ideas, because what do you actually have to do to redistribute that money? Well, it means you have to take from other people forcibly. There has to be a threat of violence or a threat of some kind of violation of your rights. You have to threaten jail time in order to take that person's money. And there is no choice in the matter. That has to happen. And when you're giving it to those people, there is no contingency plan. There is no way to understand exactly how that's helping those people. It's simply a cash transfer. And that orthodoxy, the idea that that is how you solve poverty and that is how you help people, that is what I began to question.
I think you've hit on some really key points there, because we all have the same aim. All three of us have the exact same aim, is we want prosperity for everyone. We want as many people to be lifted out of poverty, and we want as many people to live wonderful, prosperous lives as possible. But we just have different ways of getting there from socialists, from the left. And I think one of the things that I always point out to maybe more of my left-wing friends or more of my friends who disagree with me is we are all aiming at the same thing. We just have a different process. And I think that one of the things that always saddens me is that they seem to think that people on the right, like us, or people on the libertarian free market right, are heartless and don't want people to be lifted out of poverty. No, we just disagree with the methods to do that. And I think it's something we've lost in society. And we've spoken about this, or Steve, you've spoken about this a lot before, this idea of kind of agreeing to disagree. And we can have a total reasonable debate about this process to reach prosperity for everyone. But we should never have this debate, or at least for most people, about the idea that we aren't all trying to lift everyone out of poverty. And actually, we have history on our side.
Yes.
What has been the best thing to lift people out of poverty? It's been the free market.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right about that. It's also maybe the seed was sort of sown when I met Steve, and Steve spoke to me about how I communicate those ideas. I recently actually gave a workshop to some students over in Germany at Students for Liberty, where I gave a 3-hour workshop on how you communicate liberty and what the best ways to do that are. And we sort of went through the practicing of that. But in one of the workshop aspects I spoke about, I called it the messaging lab, which I thought was quite good, where we looked at messaging. So they had to come up with a policy idea, and we had to work through, and as a workshop, we developed how we were going to communicate that particular idea. And this sort of is my entire theory about communicating liberty, which is that we have to take away the fact that the left have this monopoly over compassion. Yeah. They seem to be the only political thought, the only political ideas in which they are seen as compassionate and we are not. You know, if we were to think about this as left and right, although I think that the left-right dichotomy is not necessarily very helpful in all instances, but you know, the right think the left are wrong, but the left think the right are evil. You know, we might think that we all want the world to be a better place, and yet we have different approaches, as you've just outlined, Harry. But they genuinely think that we do not want the world to be a better place for everybody.
So let's pick up on this. So we know that loads of public policy right now doesn't work for people. We've already said the NHS isn't good enough and we can't afford it. Pensions we know are unaffordable. Housing's an absolute disaster for young people, whether they want to buy or to rent. Market failure or state failure?
Absolutely state failure in all of these aspects. But this is the problem, right? When the government have crowded out so much of the market, it is so difficult for the market to succeed when you've got huge amounts of regulation, when we're suffering under the highest tax burden since Second World War. Public spending as a proportion of GDP is about 44%. And it's just going to increase and increase and increase. We saw in the month of July, we saw no economic growth, zero economic growth. I mean, this is insane, especially when we're comparing ourselves to other countries like the US that are comfortably above the 3% mark, even after the mayhem they've experienced this year. Clearly, something is going wrong in this country. And to answer your question, Steve, the reason why it is so obviously big government that is at fault here is that when you're looking at all of the specific aspects, I look at housing. Why is it we can't build enough homes? You know, clearly there is a supply issue. Clearly supply is not meeting with demand. And even if immigration was to stop tomorrow, we would still have about 4 million homes that are missing. So clearly building needs to happen and it isn't happening. And part of it is the regulatory burden is just so stringent. I was speaking to somebody the other day that was saying they wanted to do a loft conversion. It took 5 years for the council to approve it. A loft conversion, for goodness sake. I mean, this is absolutely absurd, the current situation that we are in. And bringing it back to who this actually hurts. Who does this actually hurt? Who is the government hurting by restricting housing supply? It is those that are first-time buyers, those that are trying to get on the housing ladder, and it is those that are last-time buyers. If you are an elderly couple and your children have moved out and you want to downsize, you don't want to have to pay the high energy bills that you're paying for your large 5-bedroom home, you're not going to be able to downsize because you're going to be paying huge amounts of money in stamp duty, which completely gums up the market. And at the same time, you're thinking, you know what, whilst I have all of these memories in this house, even if I want to downsize, there isn't going to be housing that is appropriate for me. So all people on all sides of the spectrum are being hurt by this. Housing is not just a young people issue. It is not just a new migrant issue. It is an issue that is facing every aspect of the demographic scale. And it's really important that we have those honest conversations. And it is not the fault of the market or the fault of big developers not building appropriate housing. It's all about incentives. And when incentives are wrong, when incentives are off, when incentives are being skewed by the government, of course, negative outcomes occur. And this is basically what's happened with Britain's broken housing market.
I think on this point of kind of state failure versus market failure, it's certainly somewhere where we've lost the comms battle, because across so many areas, people think that the free market's at fault, that it's, unbridled capitalism is at fault. And yet every public service more or less has the highest funding it's ever had. The size of the state has never been bigger. There's never been more regulations. And yet somehow people think we have capitalism unleashed in the UK. And it feels like it's somewhere we have just completely lost the comms battle. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is a really, really good point. I think part of it is the fact that people feel as though the current system, the status quo, is quote unquote capitalism. Now, I think we need to be very honest about what we actually mean by the free market, right? All of us here will talk about the free market. The free market is the voluntary exchange of goods and services. Why is the market moral? It's because it is voluntary. The market is based on consent. No person should be coerced or forced into making a transaction they don't want to. And no other person should be forced or completely put into prison for not making that exchange if they don't want to. That is what is moral about capitalism. It is the free exchange. It is the market. And that is the real system here. What people think about at the moment when we talk about capitalism is crony capitalism. It is large businesses effectively lobbying the government for special privileges. This is the case in so many aspects. I mean, we see, why is it a lot of the big tech companies were quite supportive of the CMA having huge powers? Because any new regulation acts as a barrier to all of the new entrants, right? If you're a big company, you don't want new entrants, you don't want competition. And so you lobby the government, say, we need to protect the children, we need to protect the environment, we need to protect all of these groups. You have political incentives that are completely skewed. And then people say, well, things are going wrong because we've got big government, things are going wrong because we've got big companies that are coerced with government. Clearly, the problem here is the government being able to have a monopoly over this power. They can decide what the regulatory framework looks like. That is clearly the problem. The problem is not the market in itself. The problem is the government's intervention in that market.
Yeah. Now, I want to get on to think tanks.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us, how did you come to join the Institute of Economic Affairs?
Very good question. Well, I was actually a ASI baby to start with.
Oh.
So I interned
at the... support the ASI.
Oh, they're fantastic. So I interned at the Adam Smith Institute in 2022 when I was in between my second and third year at university. I heard about them from Maxwell Marlowe, who I think still works at the ASI. And he was in his third year at LSE. So we knew each other from the LSE Hayek Society. And we got to know everything that was going on in the think tank world, learning a little bit more about what think tanks were. I didn't even know what a think tank was until I was at university.
So tell us, Reem.
What is a think tank? Well, in my mind, a think tank is an organisation that attempts to improve public understanding of public policy. So for the IEA, its mission is to, see if I actually remember what the mission is, to analyse and expound the role of markets in solving economic and social problems. So when it was 2022, I was 19 years old and I started interning at the ASI and I was doing research. And then when I was at the ASI, I was like, oh, what's this think tank around the corner, the IEA? And I became absolutely obsessed with reading the IEA's long history of archives. I mean, the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, was founded in 1955 by a chicken farmer called Anthony Fisher, who was really upset about the current place of things. It was, the post-World War II era. His brother Basil Fisher had just died in the Battle of Britain, 85 years since the Battle of Britain this year. And what had happened is he had seen his brother die for liberty, die for fighting for freedom in this country. And as a farmer over in a Sussex farm, he was experiencing the Egg Marketing Board decide how much he sells the price of his eggs for. He was experiencing the government regulating and restricting and taxing every single aspect of his job. So he one day came across The Road to Serfdom's, the Reader's Digest version of The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, and was absolutely enamoured by the ideas. He went to LSE and found Hayek, knocked on his door, and he said, hey Hayek, hey bro, I love everything you've written about. I am a farmer and I really hate the current situation. I cannot bear to see Britain in decline. I'm going to go and become a politician and I'm going to go and do everything you said. And Hayek warned him against that and said, as a politician, you will be bound by political incentives. There is a restriction on what you're able to achieve. You've got to go and win the battle of ideas. Yeah. And so he founded the Institute of Economic Affairs in 1955, after making his millions by bringing battery chicken farming over from America. So Anthony Fisher, I'm fascinated by this man's life. I know the Fisher family quite well, and I'm fascinated by him as an individual because he was just, a regular guy. He had a job in the city. He fought in the war. His brother died in the Second World War. He is one person that experienced the absolute ills of socialism. Rationing was still happening. The government were intervening in so many aspects of their lives. He was trying to feed people in a time where food was at high levels of shortages. I mean, it was really, really quite abysmal. And the government, these bureaucrats that had no idea a single thing about farming, were dictating exactly how we did that. And that's what he wanted to fight against. And he wasn't an academic, but he came from that perspective. And what he tried to do is improve the public understanding of the role of markets. And he understood those ideas and he was inspired by Hayek. And I think it was just so wonderful that he was able to go to LSE. Yeah. Now, what's interesting is David Dimbleby did a Radio 4 documentary series starting with this story, the story of Anthony Fisher, the chicken farmer, and how it then influenced Margaret Thatcher and her policies. What's interesting is after the 80s, it goes on to say, David Dimbleby goes on to say, we now live in that world. We now live in this free market world. And I thought that the series, the beginning, was really fantastic at explaining the story of how the IEA was founded and how we sought to influence policy and how Keith Joseph ended up coming across our pamphlets and we ended up bringing Thatcher over to the IEA offices to go and meet Hayek. I think that story is brilliant. But then to say that we now live in a free market utopia is absolutely absurd.
It is amazing because we spoke about this a little bit at the start. Taxes have literally never been higher. State spending has never been greater and is only shooting up more. And yet somehow people are convinced we're living in a free market world. It's absolute insanity. And I think that one of the reasons why we have lost this comms battle or lost this battle is that we have conceded on the language front. Kristen Niemitz of the IEA wrote a fantastic book, Socialism, the failed dream.
The failed idea that never dies.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things, one of the big problems in the world today is you can say you're a socialist and, no one reacts particularly badly. And you say you're free marketeer or capitalist, they're like, oh, really?
Yeah, you're a neoliberal.
Yeah. And
yet, friends with you.
Yeah. And yet socialism has literally killed tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people across the world throughout history.
I don't know how they get away with denying it, really.
It's amazing. They say, oh, no, that wasn't real socialism.
Because it wasn't utopia.
Yeah,
it's funny, isn't it? Because their methods always end up in the same disaster.
It's really interesting. So if you go back to even the 1500s, Saint-Simon, who was one of the first utopian socialists, and he was a European unity utopian socialist, so really combined a lot there. And
God, being a Remainer around a socialist.
in
Let's
the 1500s.
not alienate too many people.
But, he writes some very, very interesting pieces. I don't think they've been particularly widely read about, what this dream could look like of, a socialist kind of utopia. And to be fair to him, he was writing during feudalist times, so we can give him maybe a slight pass on certain aspects. But it is utopian. And you never really reach utopia. And what's so interesting about his writings, you read it, you go, oh, that would be great. Yes, that would be great. But no one has ever managed to implement any form of that kind of vision. Until we, and I know I spoke about it earlier, but, until we really recapture the language, it does feel like we'll keep losing because people either misconstrue what we say or they just misconstrue the way the world has developed around them.
Well, this is the comms argument that we discussed earlier. And I think part of the problem is, that's sort of basically why the IEA exists as a whole, right? As a think tank, we're seeking to talk about the way that markets can solve these problems and solve economic and social problems. But also, we're not just a university that publishes research and that sits on the shelves. When I interned at the IEA in 2022, the week before I started my internship, I got my first media appearance. It was a talk TV producer that had seen my TikToks and said, "Why don't you come on the show?" And I was like, "Oh, great, YOLO! I'm 19. Why not?" So I went on the show, and I carried on doing that, and I absolutely loved talking, clearly, if you couldn't tell. Absolutely loved talking about liberty. It was my favourite thing to do, and I discovered that I really,
It's so
really
wonderful,
enjoyed
isn't it? Liberty is so wonderful.
Liberty is so great, and being able to talk
Not
about
being
it.
told what to do.
Yeah.
Don't touch my stuff. I mean, that's basically my principles. And then when we got to that stage and I was an intern, I remember being so excited to be a part of the IEA, just purely because of its history, its influence with, Hayek's influence on the IEA, IEA's influence on Thatcher. And I think it was just so exciting to even just move tables and chairs and make coffees and, be a part of a team that it was there to fight for free markets. And most people think tanks are just a bunch of academics sat in a room, when actually academics make up one team out of many. I've discovered when I was an intern at the IEA, whilst I would love to go and do a master's degree and become an academic, which was absolutely my plan, I discovered that there is a whole career out there in communicating liberty and actually taking the fantastic ideas of Christian Niemitz and Chris Snowden and all of my fantastic academic colleagues and turning that into stuff that people actually understand, read, listen, watch, and consume.
We need to wrap up by saying kind of where does it all end and what do we do to influence what politicians actually do? Because at the moment, the reason I've set this project up to amplify voices for freedom, especially all of the great think tanks that we have, is because I'm afraid I think we're headed into quite a bad place unless we change course. I mean, the pension system's unaffordable, both public sector and state. The national debt is about 95, I think it is, £1,000 per household. It's a pretty bad situation unless we start getting serious growth. So where are we headed and what do politicians need to do about it?
I'm afraid I think we're headed towards a debt crisis. I mean, things are relatively abysmal when you're looking at it from what the government spends money on and what they're able to actually achieve politically. I mean, you're absolutely right, Steve. I mean, when you're looking at what the government spends money on as a whole, and, we said earlier, public spending as a proportion of GDP is about 44%, when the economy as a whole isn't growing, and we haven't seen growth over the last month, that is a pretty worrying state to be in when public spending is increasing, and it is increasing for all of the reasons you've just outlined. Old age pensioners, when you have welfare that is increasing. So when you're looking at, I was looking at the IFS's breakdown of what the government actually spends money on. I think it's really interesting. A lot of it is debt interest payments.
Isn't that fourth biggest or third biggest, more than our school's budget?
It's insane. It is more than the school's budget. It's about 10% of
so
the total
we
public
spend
spending.
more on servicing our debt than we do on schools in Britain.
Yeah, it's
and we
insane.
I'm afraid it is partly the Conservative Party's fault. There's no getting away from it.
Yeah.
We also spend, then it's okay, why are we spending so much that we can't afford? Why do we need to get ourselves into so much debt? We spend more on pensions than we do on defence, policing and education alone.
And yet the Conservative Party and Reform want us to celebrate that they managed to persuade Labour, force Labour to U-turn on quite a modest cut to means testing winter fuel
ensuring millionaires don't receive an amount of money.
Amounts of money.
Yeah.
The winter fuel payments debate was so interesting because there was GB News did a campaign for pensioners on the winter fuel payments, and saying all these pensioners are going to starve, and GB News were, who I love as a company, I love the news channel, I think they're fantastic, please don't stop inviting me on. but they, they did go for the sort of, here's the emotional argument,
it's easy.
rather than the practical principle.
So here's the problem, isn't it? If the public keep demanding higher spending plus lower taxes, they'll get the debt and inflation crisis that they've asked for.
And what does that actually mean? It means that the tax burden is just being kicked down the road towards the next generation. I mean, genuinely, as a 23-year-old that is looking to get married and have children in the next few years, I'm actually thinking about what my future looks like in Britain and whether or not having children in this country is the right place to be.
If I can say so, as a 54-year-old who's starting to think about, in 10 to 15 years, maybe 15 to 20 years, maybe retiring, I might even, need the NHS and my state pension, and it's going to default on me around the time that I retire. And this is no good for anyone at any age at all.
I think we should make this very clear to everyone watching. The state pension will not exist in 20 years in the same way it is now, because either it would have completely collapsed, we would have reformed it in some way, or the government will change the mandate of the Bank of England, find some way to print more money, whether that is through quantitative easing.
Yes,
And so the value is just so much. It's so interesting because I've gotten so much hate from pensioners about what I've said about the state pension, where all I've said is that it's clearly unsustainable, and
Well, we want them to receive it.
Well,
We
that
want
is
them
the
to receive
thing.
it. We want them
would
to,
like- Ladies and gentlemen, we would like you to receive the state pension that you need. We don't want anyone going cold or hungry. The problem is, right now, we're on a trajectory to people going cold and hungry because we're going to default on the welfare state.
And the problem is that when you have 25% of pensioners being millionaires, it's obvious that the state pension needs to be means tested. The state pension is nothing. I mean, £150 a week?
It is not
It's
much.
nothing.
And when you see, I mean, I remember a long time ago going around a supermarket on pension day and watching pensioners counting the pennies. It's tragic. And actually what we need to do is better fund those who are
Yes.
most in
But
need.
this comes
But
back
Lord
to what...
Alan Sugar doesn't need a state pension.
No.
The 25% of millionaires do not need a state pension.
And this comes back to what we were saying at the start, which is actually all of us just want to make everyone as prosperous as possible.
And I think let it be recorded, actually. You said earlier that Millet has managed to increase welfare benefits by cutting the state and getting rid of
It's
waste.
really amazing.
And actually, that is where we should be, is that we should be better targeting resources
When-
at those who...
when
You
you
actually
cut the,
need it.
when you cut the state, you can make what is left work so much better for everyone.
Absolutely. There's also been on the lower end of the spectrum, as in by age, where we're in a situation in which
Our age, I want to be included in the 20s.
Yes, I'm talking about working age people, so all three of us are in this category. Where we're in a situation where 25% of those people aren't in work. So economic inactivity is a huge problem. Now, again, when I was looking at this pie of what the government spend money on, welfare, working age welfare is an enormous expense. But even just taking away that for a second, Fraser Nelson did a really, really fantastic documentary with Channel 4 where he spoke to these people, many of these people that are economically inactive, many of them that are claiming long-term sickness benefits, due to ill health. A lot of that ill health is mental illness. I think it's just over 60% of new claims since 2019 have been due to mental health. Where is the compassion in sending literally thousands of people across the country who claim to have depression and anxiety? Where is the compassion in sending those thousands of people home and saying, you don't have what it takes to work? Don't worry, you don't need a purpose in life, you can just stay at home. We're paying people to literally not have a life. We are consigning millions of people across the country to a lifetime of worklessness. I don't care what the left says, I don't care what the authoritarians say, I don't care what Reform might say, I don't care what they say. There is nothing compassionate about the current system. Nothing compassionate. What is really worrying is the number of young people. There was an NHS Confederation report that found that between 2021 and 2022, 63,000 people went from being economically inactive because they were students to then being economically inactive because they were on long-term sickness.
Reem,
How does that happen?
This
I
has
think
been-
a lot of blame comes from our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and locking everyone in their homes for several years. I really think that
Well, the problem is the big state, right?
Yes, the problem is the big
fact that
state, yes.
The government are paying people to stay at home. We have economic inactivity through the roof. We aren't able to build enough homes, so those people aren't able to afford housing.
Yeah.
Jobs aren't available because we have increased the amount of money that it costs to employ somebody. We have increased regulations, which of course has increased the cost to employers. And on top of all of that, we have raised taxes through the roof and we refuse to cut spending. We are in an absolute doom loop and we need to do something radical to solve it.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm voting
ladies
for
and
Reem.
gentlemen, this is what happens when passionate and well-informed young people come together to discuss freedom, when they become incredibly angry with the state and how the state is promoting suffering. Harry, brilliant as always, but Reem, what a joy
Thank
to
you so
hear you
much.
speak. An amazing advocate for liberty, just so well-informed and eloquent, and above all, courageous, and you're a real inspiration. So thank you
Thank you
very
so
much
much.
indeed. This has been The Insurgency with me, Steve Baker. Please do like and share our content. Please subscribe to the Substack and please subscribe to the podcast. Thanks very much indeed for watching.